Good evening and welcome. My name is Mike Pride. In September, I succeeded the irreplaceable Sig Gisler as administrator of the Pulitzer Prizes. Sig is a friend and guiding light, and among other things, the father of the annual Pulitzer All-Class Lectures. He's in the second row tonight with his wife, Mary. Together, they were foster parents to a generation of journalism students here. Please give them a round of applause. Like many of you, I'm worried about the future of journalism. But preparing for this event, I saw in the work of our speakers what sterling journalism is still being produced in these challenging times. It is saddening, of course, to think of deathly ill coal miners being cheated out of medical care, of brain-damaged soldiers forced out of the military and robbed of their benefits, or of the people of Detroit dying because fire engines and ambulances don't show up on time. But it is heartening that journalists still do the good work of giving silent victims a voice and forcing society to face problems that would otherwise remain invisible. The theme of our program tonight is the coverage of the overlooked and neglected. This fits a maxim lifted from the work of Finley Peter Dunne, the satirist of the muckraking era. What he said was, in a somewhat different way, as I said, it was lifted from his work. It's not exactly the way he meant it. A journalist's job is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. In describing the Pulitzer Prize winning series of Chris Hamby, his employer wrote, "It is difficult to imagine someone more voiceless or whose suffering is more silent than the Appalachian coal miner." Here is a quotation harvested by Dave Phillips for his Pulitzer winner on the military's practice of booting out soldiers with brain trauma. One veteran told Hamby, "It was like my best friend betrayed me. I had given the Army everything, and they took everything away." And here is the space into which Stephen Henderson poured his Pulitzer-winning columns on money-starved Detroit. He called it the gap between the promise of functional city government and the reality of a citizenry that suffers and dies from the utter collapse of basic service delivery. Allow me to further introduce the four outstanding journalists seated before you. There are five, actually, because Sheila is also an outstanding journalist. Beginning on your left, they are Chris Hamby, now an investigative reporter for BuzzFeed. This year, Chris won the Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting. His stories exposed powerful legal and medical forces that systematically rejected diagnoses of black lung disease that would have gotten coal miners decent care. Chris is a native of Nashville, Tennessee, who studied journalism at the University of Richmond and the University of Missouri, where he received a master's degree. He lives and works in Washington, D.C. Dave Phillips won the Pulitzer Prize in national reporting this year as a reporter for the Gazette in Colorado Springs. For more than a dozen years, he covered the military and the consequences of war for his paper. He was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 2010. His winning work showed how the downsizing military used minor infractions as excuses to discharge brain-damaged veterans. Dave now reports and writes about the veterans of the military for the New York Times. I'm also supposed to add that he is a 2002 alumnus of this school, although he says for a long time the school was willing for everyone to forget that. That's not true anymore. Beside Dave is Joanna Bean, the editor of his project. Joanna has been at the Gazette in Colorado Springs for more than 20 years. She started there as a business reporter and worked her way up. She was named editor of the paper earlier this year. She has overseen many other big stories for the Gazette, from enterprise reporting on medical marijuana to coverage of devastating wildfires. She began her career at a weekly in Littleton, Colorado, and has worked for the Fort Collins Coloradan as well. Stephen Henderson has been the editorial page editor of the Detroit Free Press since 2009. Earlier, he worked for the Baltimore Sun, the Chicago Tribune, the Lexington Herald Leader in Kentucky, and the Knight Ridder Washington Bureau. Stephen is also a commentator on Detroit Public Television. During a recent appearance, he spoke as a native of Detroit who had come back to the city to work by choice. My work means more to me here than it would anywhere else, he said. Some of you might have the chance someday to go back to your hometowns as journalists. If you do, you might want to tuck Stephen's thought away. Stephen won the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for commentary for his columns showing how Detroit's profound budget problems affected the lives of people who still remain there after years of economic decline and flight to the suburbs. The panel tonight will be moderated by Sheila Coronel, Director of the Stabile Center for Investigative Journalism. The format will follow as this. Each Pulitzer winner will have 15 minutes to speak his or her piece, followed by 5 minutes of questions from you about that particular work. Then, at the end, there will be a 20-minute session during which you may ask questions of any of the journalists on the panel. Sheila, thanks so much for your work in preparing for tonight. It's all yours.
Thank you, Mike. Good evening, everyone. One of the greatest pleasures of being here at Columbia Journalism School for me is the chance to ask questions of Pulitzer Prize winners and to celebrate the great reporting that they have done. Those of you who want to tweet tonight's events, that's our hashtag, and those are the Twitter handles of all our panelists. And before we begin, a word from our sponsor. The Columbia Journalism School is now open for admissions. One of our admissions staff is at the back. Her name is Taryn Almanzar. You can speak to her personally, or you can call or email us. Oops, sorry. Let me start with the first story, Chris Hamby's story. It's a series of stories called Breathless and Burdened. I will give a few minutes to introduce the story and then ask questions of Chris. In some forgotten parts of the country, men and women still live and die for coal. Hidden away in the Appalachians, they spend lifetimes underground in the coal mines where they inhale the coal dust that blackens their lungs and chokes off their breath. In 1969, in reaction to the deaths of thousands of coal miners from black lung disease, Congress passed the Coal Act, which imposed health and safety standards in coal mines. It also compensated miners stricken by black lung, which is caused by the inhalation of coal dust. Since the 1990s, there has been a revival of the disease. Some 85,000 US coal miners face new dangers posed by the increasingly toxic mixture of dust generated by advanced machines that rapidly chew through coal and rock. For an average wage of just $25 an hour, they risk explosions, rock falls, fires, and disease. Today, more than 6% of miners in Central Appalachia are afflicted with black lung. When Chris Hamby, a reporter for the nonprofit Center for Public Integrity, began researching black lung, he was surprised to find that only a small number of coal workers stricken with the disease win compensation from the Labor Department. He also found that coal companies appeal almost every award. But there was more. Hamby obtained hundreds of thousands of previously confidential documents from the courts and other places. He created the first ever database of doctors' opinions. He also traversed the hills of Appalachia, visiting clinics and sitting with miners in their homes as they gasped for breath or inhaled oxygen from a tank. Investigative journalism is about finding patterns of wrongdoing, and this is what Chris found. Eminent lawyers and doctors working for the coal industry resorted to the most clever and underhanded tactics to deny sick and dying miners meager benefits and affordable care. He found that the industry's favorite law firm for dealing with coal miners' claims withheld medical evidence that would have worked in the miners' favor. He also found that within the Johns Hopkins Medical Institution was a little-known unit of doctors who have long been the coal industry's favorite experts. These doctors consistently provided opinions crucial to defeating the miners' claims, even though the doctors' methods were unsound and their conclusions were wrong. Hamby found miners like Stephen Day, shown here in the picture, who worked in an underground coal mine in West Virginia for 35 years. He gasped for air, slept upright in a recliner, and inhaled oxygen from a tank 24 hours a day. Doctors he consulted agreed he had black lung, yet Steve's longtime employer fought vigorously to avoid paying him. As a result, he and his family were barely scraping by, sometimes resorting to loans from relatives or neighbors to make it through. The impact of this story was immediate and dramatic. 2 days after publication, Johns Hopkins suspended its black lung program, pending a review. U.S. senators began crafting laws to reform the benefit system, and Congress urged the Labor Department to investigate its own claims system. Chris Hamby, congratulations for winning the Pulitzer Prize for Investigative Reporting.
Thank you.
Chris, tell us how you found this story.
Well, I'd done quite a bit of reporting previously on environment, public health, and labor issues, and I came across this in the wake of the Upper Big Branch mine disaster that occurred in 2010. 29 men were killed in southern West Virginia in an explosion there. There was a report from the governor's task force that one page in this, I believe 130-page or so report, mentioned sort of as an aside that they had performed autopsies on 24 of the miners who were killed in this accident, and 17 of them had black lung. That is a shocking number, and that led me to look at why that was happening. And why government researchers were finding that there was this resurgence in the disease that was supposed to have been virtually eradicated years ago, decades ago. And as I was reporting in the coal fields, I kept hearing all about the benefit system and doctors and lawyers who were involved, and it was somewhat intimidating to try and tackle that. And I sort of resisted it initially, but eventually the stories of these men and their families pulled me into it. I just got to a point where I couldn't ignore the compelling human drama of it, and so I started looking at the doctors and the lawyers involved.
Why the doctors and the lawyers?
Well, I got pulled into this initially because, you know, as an investigative reporter, it's very difficult to say, I want to investigate the entire black lung benefit system. I mean, it's unwieldy. There has to be, that's more of a topic, as I like to say, than a story. So, you know, I resisted that sort of topic, but then I came across the case of Gary Fox, who was a coal miner who was wrongfully denied benefits because the preeminent law firm that represents coal companies had withheld crucial evidence that they'd obtained in his case, and he was forced to go back to work for a number of years. He got progressively sicker until he needed a lung transplant and had to retire and filed a new benefits claim, and he died waiting on a lung transplant. Now, I started looking at that and started looking at whether what happened in his case was a pattern. Because as horrific as that would be, you know, what we really want to establish is this a broader issue? And that's when all the use of a lot of previously confidential records came into play. And that's sort of how I started examining the lawyers.
Well, tell us about, you got confidential records, court documents that were not public, as well as doctors' opinions, which, as you know, health information is not public. How did you get hold of these documents?
Right, so pretty much everything in the black lung system is protected by privacy laws, and that is probably as it should be, because there is a lot of private medical and financial information in these records. It's not just like a normal case file in a court. And so now the final decision by the judge is publicly available online. They at least make that much available. But you don't get to see what led up to that, and you don't get to really examine sort of the key filings. And what I needed to do to establish the tactics that the lawyers were using was to actually look at, in great detail, at the specific filings and medical reports and what was withheld and what wasn't withheld in specific cases. And the only way to do that was to get the permission of the people whose cases they were. And so this, it took a while to identify potential cases of interest. And then I, after consulting with a number of people, crafted a very brief form that I asked people if they would be willing to sign, where they would basically fill in their name, social security number, and signature and allow me to access their full files. And amazingly, almost all of them said yes and gave me access to their files because they felt like they had been grievously wronged by the system that was there to protect them.
And what did the files show?
The files showed a pattern of withholding crucial evidence in claims against minors, and not just withholding evidence, but also leading judges and other lawyers and even their own consulting doctors to rely on evidence that they had very, very good reason to believe was inaccurate and misleading.
The court files actually showed that?
Yes.
And
yes,
can
you can
give
see
an
what's.
example? Yeah.
Yes. So in the case of Gary Fox, for example, it was later disclosed, and these were in the files that I got, that there were 2 reports that they had obtained of, well, for instance, Gary had part of his lung removed because they were afraid that he had cancer, and so they wanted to rule that out. The local pathologist at a hospital, who has no particular expertise in black lung and wasn't looking for it, made a vague diagnosis and just ruled out cancer. He didn't connect that to black lung, but the law firm obtained slides of his lung tissue without his knowledge, had them read by 2 of their own pathologists who said this is the most severe form of black lung, and then withheld that evidence. And that was actually in the file when I was able to get it.
You also put together a database of doctors' opinions, and I want to show how you put that together. Can you explain this graphic to us? Yeah.
Yes, and that was actually put together by our wonderful graphics person, Chris Zubak-Skis. He brought the mishmash of data that I had in a really messy Excel file into this, which I think pretty clearly conveys Dr. Wheeler's record. Dr. Wheeler is the head of the black lung unit at Johns Hopkins. And so I went through and logged about, let's see, it was more than 3,400 x-rays in 1,500 cases that have been decided since 2000 in which Dr. Wheeler had weighed in. He had never once found the severe form of black lung that would entitle you to automatic compensation, and only occasionally found even the very minimal form, but usually the miners were not able to win based on that. So you can see here, I was also able to compare other doctors' readings of the exact same films that Dr. Wheeler was looking at. So each dot is an x-ray. And the green ones are positive readings, and the red ones are negative readings. And you can see pretty clearly, looking at the same x-rays, doctors saw very, very different things from Dr. Wheeler in many, many cases.
It's fantastic, yeah. Taking on lawyers and doctors is like an invitation to not one lawsuit, but several lawsuits,
yeah.
right? So how did you bulletproof this story? How did you make sure that you would not be sued in court for your findings?
There were some sleepless nights with this one because, I mean, I think probably if I'd told my editors in advance we're going to take on a major law firm and one of the most prestigious universities in the world, they probably would have said, "You're nuts, let's stop this." But, you know, we have I basically went over and over and over everything, just sort of meticulously logged what I was finding in the court files and reviewed everything that was entered in the spreadsheet multiple times. And then when it actually came time to write the story, that's frequently a big issue, is translating what you've found into language that is compelling for a reader, but also not libelous. And so that was a lot of work, and then there was an extra added difficulty of trying to get the law and the medicine right. And so I would call experts and read them specific passages and say, is this right? We tweak the language a little bit to make sure I'm not mischaracterizing anything or misinterpreting anything I'm saying. And then at the Center for Public Integrity, there's a very detailed fact-checking process where every fact in a story, so multiple facts per sentence usually, would have to be footnoted. So our in-house lawyer, Peter Smith, God bless him. This story was this project. I would just every installment I would hand him something like this, and it was just all the documents that he had to go through, and then there were a lot of electronic documents too. So I felt terrible for him. So we did that, and we also had it reviewed by outside counsel, and so we felt pretty confident by the time we went to press with it.
And there was no pushback from Johns Hopkins or the law firm?
I was prepared for some pushback, but I was pleasantly surprised that there really wasn't. I was actually quite surprised. Really, the only reaction that we got was 2 days later, Johns Hopkins said, "We've suspended this unit."
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, I want you to ask some questions. While you go up there, I'm going to ask what else has changed since the story's publication.
Sure. So you mentioned the suspension of the program at Johns Hopkins. There has been, Senator Bob Casey and Jay Rockefeller, working with some other senators and George Miller in the House, have put together a bill that would overhaul the black lung benefits system. We'll see what chance that or any legislation has in Congress, but now there have also been things that the Labor Department has done administratively to try and address this. So they've begun a rulemaking process where they will seek to address the issue of lawyers withholding medical evidence in cases. They've started pilot programs that would allow minors to basically have access to better medical evidence to try and close that gap in the quality of evidence that they're able to present in cases. And then in certain cases, Labor Department lawyers will actually be told to intervene on behalf of minors to make sure that they have at least the solid basis of a case to go forward.
Any questions from our audience? Can you please go to the microphone?
Do you consider yourself a superhero? I mean, it's true.
No, not at all. I think the people I
I'm
write
a
about
superhero.
are.
If I speak as an old man, homosexual, Latino, and black, I won't be here. I won't be get 2 inches from where you can do it. You're actually a superhero for these people. Sanskrit is all, most of them, unfortunately, they're all white. I never heard of a black man having black lung. Thank you.
I promise I did not pay him.
Are you a superhero?
No, but really a lot of the people in these stories are in a lot of ways, and some of the minors and some of their advocates are, frankly, their actions are heroic and self-effacing and pretty remarkable.
Yes, please go in. Yeah.
So you've talked a lot about the documents that you looked at, but you also mentioned the human drama and how you were able to sort of talk to sources and get them to open up to you and give their social security numbers. What was that magic touch that you had? How much time did you spend with them day to day? How did you balance the looking through documents and court filings and actually talking to people and getting to know them at a human level?
Right, there's only so much time you can spend looking at a document or a database without going insane. So it's good to have, to interact with sources to keep you balanced and actually a human being. I think the biggest thing, I was surprised that people agreed to the level of access that they did. I could not have done this story without that. But I think probably one of the key things was just I never try and just sit down and immediately start asking people a million questions and saying, tell me about how you're dying of lung disease, and tell me about how you got royally screwed in this system. Or I certainly wouldn't sit down and say, will you sign this thing and give me your social? So I would just I learned a lot about mining and talk to them. People like to talk about their jobs, people like to talk about their lives, and they want to, if you kind of show that you're genuinely interested in that, I think that sort of breaks down the barrier of, there was some natural apprehension of the guys coming in from Washington, but of course it helps that I'm from Tennessee. But I think just listening to people and not pressing them immediately, and I think they sort of hopefully grew to trust me. I think many of them did.
I was wondering, you talked about databases, and I was curious whether you built that database by hand, and if you could talk about, what the fields look like, and what did you have in the database, and was it connected to did you try to connect it to anything else? And then I'm not completely clear on when you asked people to give you permission to look at their medical records, were those medical records all sort of held by the courts, or who had access to, for instance, the secret medical records that lawyers were keeping in Gary's case, for instance, that never came out in court?
Sure. I'll address your second one first and then rewind. Those are actually on file at the Labor Department, but you can't get them without this sort of permission form, and I did have some conversations with some people at the Labor Department.
So these are filings for medical compensation. This is why they were
Right,
in
yeah,
the
and
Labor
it all
Department.
goes through a government system now, even though it's typically paid by the mining company. And then the spreadsheet question. Whenever you build your own database, it's sort of an evolving process, and you inevitably realize partway through that you should have been recording something all along, and that the fields that you created that you thought were important were not the only ones that were important, and that actually you've probably been recording stuff that's completely useless as well. So there were lots of iterations of it, but it was basically just case number, person's name, date, whether they won or lost, and then what Dr. Wheeler read the x-ray as and what the other doctor read the x-ray as. And that was, I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but that was basically it.
But that entailed looking at how many hundreds or thousands of...
Yeah, there were about 3,400 individual films in about 1,500 cases.
Right. Yes, please.
What's the writing process in a story like this? You talked a lot about, you know, the amazing sort of investigative work that you did, but the actual sort of putting the story together, like, this is my lead, this is where I'm going to, like, tell everyone, like, what happened. You know, how do you start, like, outlining that story, something as sort of big as this?
Yeah, it's a really long process. I mean, I love writing. That's how I got into journalism, actually, because I liked writing, and then realized I liked reporting too. So I have outlines, but they're really, really rough, and I just kind of, I don't know. I just start with some main things that I want to hit up high. Usually, I mean, I think any reporter will probably tell you that once you get the lead, or in this case, the top section worked out, everything kind of flows from there. But I mean, it's basically just figuring out how I can hit the key points that I want to make while also integrating humanity into it, so that I can basically say, you know, reader, here's why you should be outraged at what's going on here. But also, this is, you know, don't just stop here. This isn't everything. We're going to tell you the story and come with me on a journey of 5,000, 7,000. The first story was 9,000 words, and I was amazed that people read that. So it's really sort of trying to convey both that you found some really interesting stuff and I'm telling a story.
Yes, just one more question. The rest of you can ask questions at the end of the panel. That's also an incentive for you to stay on to the very end. Yes.
Thank you very much. In your introduction, I got the impression that the mine workers, the sick mine workers that you met, that they really did not have adequate legal representation. Do you think this is some kind of reflection on the legal profession? I'd like your comment on that. And can I just get a part two is, I believe that mine workers do have a union. And I wonder if you, in the course of your work, did you develop any insights into shortcomings among the advocacy that, or lack thereof, that their union was supposed to be doing for them? Thank you.
Yeah, so those two sort of go together, actually. The United Mine Workers have, they're really a shadow of what they used to be. Now I mean, when they try, they can be powerful advocates for their miners, but there has been remarkable, frankly, union busting by coal companies in the last 15 to 20 years. And so they really, it used to be that the mine workers were able to help provide some representation in some of these cases. That is really rare. It doesn't really happen much in these cases. One of the main reasons, and this is one thing that the reform legislation seeks to address about access to counsel, is basically there are a handful of people who actually work on the miner side of this thing, and it's because these cases are very, very long and drawn out. You're fighting a giant mining company in most cases that has seemingly limitless resources to hire as many doctors and lawyers as they want. You usually are stuck with the sort of whatever evidence the miner is able to get from his free exam paid by the Labor Department. And then you are actually you're legally barred from charging the miner at all for your services until the claim is final, and that's after all appeals. And even then, you then have to file a petition to justify every penny of your legal fees, and the coal company will litigate that for a prolonged period of time. And so it really has driven advocates out of the system, and so that's a large reason why you have things like the withholding of evidence and not developing adequate medical evidence in a lot of cases because there's really no one looking out for the minors in a lot of cases.
Thank you, Chris. You can ask more questions of Chris, including what it's like to work at BuzzFeed at the end of this panel. I'd like to move on to the next story that we honor today. It's about war veterans. So in 2013, after a decade of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the US Army was kicking out more soldiers for minor misconduct than ever before. Many of these troops had combat exposure. Many of them also suffer from traumatic brain injuries and post-traumatic stress, making them more likely to get into trouble. When they do get into trouble, these troops are often not honorably discharged, and as a result are stripped of medical benefits for life. Those who need help the most, therefore, end up also being the least likely to get it. In May 2013, the Colorado Springs Gazette became the first newspaper to report this nationwide surge in discharges. After the longest period of war in American history, the Gazette wrote, more soldiers like Cash Alvaro in this picture are being discharged for misconduct than at any other time. Alvaro joined the Army when he was just 18 and was hit by multiple bomb blasts in Afghanistan when he turned 19. Charged with misconduct, he was refused a medical discharge. Using data obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, the Gazette found out that since 2006, 76,000 soldiers like Alvaro have been kicked out of the Army. Gazette reporter David Phillips spent months interviewing these soldiers. He found them in homeless shelters, hospitals, abandoned trailers, ratty apartments, and jails. He showed how systemic problems with the medical retirement and deployment processes gave the Army the incentive to discharge injured soldiers for misconduct rather than treat their injuries. Sergeant Gerald Jensen in the picture was in a Hamby in Iraq when his vehicle was hit by a roadside bomb. A chunk of metal hit his head, shattering his face and putting him in a coma. After 16 surgeries, he went back to combat and was injured again. He was sent to recover in Fort Carson, but in 2011 was tested positive for amphetamines and threatened with a dishonorable discharge that would have disqualified him from medical benefits for life. Another soldier featured in the series was Sergeant Paul Sassy, who was hit by a roadside bomb in Iraq in 2007 and suffered from traumatic brain injury. He soldiered on through another tour despite shattered memory and concentration, depression, nightmares, and rage. Diagnosed with post-traumatic stress, Army doctors gave him a mix of contraindicated drugs that made him manic. He attacked his wife and the military police who tried to stop him. He was put in jail when he should have been in treatment. Later, his commander encouraged him to resign instead of getting a court-martial. This would have stripped him of benefits for life. Unsurprisingly, the Army fought the Gazette's coverage every step of the way. Local commanders refused to make key officers available. They refused to give information that was public. They urged the paper's parent company to kill the story, saying that the reporting was false and biased. Dave Phillips was threatened by a lieutenant colonel who warned that the Army had sources who knew whom the reporter was talking to, and that he better be careful. This series made impact. The number of soldiers kicked out with other than honorable discharge immediately started to drop. Congress initiated hearings, and the law was passed requiring PTSD and traumatic brain injury screenings before court-martial proceedings. The lives of those profiled by the Gazette also changed. Alvaro was given VA benefits. He is no longer homeless. Sassy was let out of jail and put in a special Army unit for wounded troops, from where he is now medically retired. Assault charges against him are likely to result in a deferred sentence. I'm pleased to introduce Dave Phillips, now with the New York Times, and his editor, the editor of this series, Joanna Bean, who is now editor of the Gazette. David, how did you become so deeply involved with the problems of struggling veterans?
I want to make just a short public service announcement.
Sure.
First, since we're at Columbia. So I was here 12 years ago, and I was intimidated and confused and figured that everybody else here knew way more about what was going on than I did, and that I was likely unable to amount to much. So I'm very surprised to be here, but I mention that just because I'm sure that there's some people in the audience who feel the same way. And I spent most of my year here screwing up, which apparently had some value. So just to say that all sorts of people can do some important work in this if they stick with it.
Thank you for saying that.
So the question was, how do we learn?
How did you become involved with this whole veteran
Okay,
story?
so Colorado Springs, for those of you who've never visited, is a great place. Is a very heavily military town. It has a huge Army base called Fort Carson, which now has about 32,000 active duty troops. So it is one of many things that our paper covers. And over the years, we covered all sorts of aspects about it: homecomings, leaving. And in 2009, we started covering a story about how there was an increased amount of crime at Fort Carson. And we did a big story that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize that basically showed that the more combat exposure the troops are having, the more likely they are to commit crime, and that the Army wasn't really addressing that, and so we were having a highly elevated rate of murder in town. And so from that, we learned a lot about PTSD and how the Army talks about how it should treat PTSD and doesn't really treat PTSD. And we became very interested in the idea of the intersection between injury and behavior, whether that be crime or otherwise. And that idea sort of simmered for a couple years until I got a call from a local advocate who said, hey, there's a guy that you have to see at the county jail. He just got brought straight back from Afghanistan. Part of the Army tried to put him into the psychiatric hospital here in town because he has PTSD, and then his commander pulled him out and put him in jail. And I said, well, that's interesting. That is the intersection of behavior and injury. And so I went and sat down with this guy at the jail and let him tell me his story. And his story was essentially that he had deployed to Iraq once and had a pretty lousy tour and had come back with some PTSD and hadn't really addressed it, as many people don't. He had put it aside to do his job and go on with his life. And he deployed again to Afghanistan and noticed that his symptoms were getting worse: sleeplessness, depression, irritability. And he went to the hospital in Afghanistan, essentially. And they put him on a dose of antipsychotic medicine. A low dose, because if they'd put him on a milligram more, they'd have to evacuate him for essentially an injury. He would have been too unstable to keep in combat. So they said, no, you just need this much, and we'll keep you and go back to work. And then a day or two later, he got in an argument with his tent mates and pulled a machine gun on them. Now, clearly, you can't have a guy with a gun acting like that in a combat outpost. So they evacuated him. And at first, they evacuated him medically, and they diagnosed him with post-traumatic stress and also with bipolar disorder, and they put him in hospital. But when his commander got home, he thought, well, no, this guy, he did something that is wrong. That's a crime, and I'm going to punish him for it. So he pulled him out, put him in the jail to wait to be court-martialed. So I came back and told Joanna all about this great story that really shows this difficult issue between that tension of what is crime that needs to be punished and what's an injury, and how do we as a society deal with it. And she said, interesting story, suss it out. So I went back, a week later to talk to him again, just chase down some details I hadn't gotten. And he was gone. He was no longer in the jail. And I started calling around to see what happened. And he had gotten a very quick discharge, where essentially his company commander had come in and said, hey, good news, we're not going to court-martial you. You sign this paper, and you can just get out today and go home to South Carolina. The guy says, great, signs the paper, he's out of the Army, he's gone. What he doesn't really understand, it's not clear whether they explained it, but obviously they didn't explain it well, is that when he signs the paper, he is resigning from the Army in lieu of court-martial, and in exchange he will never be able to apply for any VA benefits again. And so he's just gone. He's essentially like shunted off on the rest of us because the Army didn't know how to deal with the problem. And I thought, wow, that's even more interesting. They decided not to deal with this problem. They never decided whether this was an injury or misconduct. They just decided to push it off on society. I wonder how much that's happening. And so that began our process of, like Chris did, finding the people who are affected, sitting down and talking with them, getting their medical records, trying to talk to the experts that push this whole system along to figure out what is the incentive. Because I never believed that people were doing this because they were trying to be cruel to soldiers. You know, institutions, and there was no profit motive, so why? We had to understand what was the systematic shortcomings that were making this happen. And essentially, if you're in charge of a company of 120 soldiers, this injured soldier was a serious liability to you because until the soldier was gone, you couldn't get a replacement. And if you needed to deploy in 6 months to Afghanistan, you needed everybody to be functional and doing their job and in place, or people could realistically die. But you couldn't get him out medically in that time period. In fact, the medical system was so gummed up that it would take 18 months, 2 years maybe, to get this guy out. And until then, you were short. You just had no one in that spot. And so they found other ways to get them out. And they thought that that was the right thing to do. And so that was sort of the dynamic that we uncovered.
But David, it's hard enough to find these people and to get them to talk to you. But, you know, finding the documents, which you did, getting the military to, you know, give you some information. I mean, how difficult was that, and how did you manage to do this story, given, you know, the opacity of the military establishment?
I think in any story like this, you have allies that would know about the story that you're doing, or at least some facet of it, and want to get that information out. You know, whether it's an attorney that knows that you can't win a cold case or something like that. So we knew veterans advocates who had seen this happen over and over, had seen guys kicked out who were showing up at the veterans only food pantry because they can't get any benefits, they can't have a job. They knew about it and could connect us. We were able to find Army defense attorneys who had tried to, keep this from happening and had failed. And they obviously couldn't talk to us publicly because they'd get in trouble, but they certainly handed us a lot of documents. We were able to talk to other people in the Army who were observing this and didn't like it. Because the Army, is literally 1 million people. It is, there are a lot of different viewpoints within it. And so it was just a matter of connecting with the people that could help you along the way with whatever portion of the trail that they knew.
How long did this story take?
We started in December and it published in May. But
and
really
you got your FOIA request?
there was a lot of proofreading in there. I mean,
Yes. And you got your FOIA requests responded to within that time?
Yeah, because they were really simple FOIA requests, and I don't think that they even knew that, they shouldn't give it to us. Because I never found any evidence that the Army, knew this was going on and thought anything of it.
Right.
At a systemic
At a higher level. So the bummer about FOIA requests is that oftentimes, maybe this is just in the military, but I have a feeling it's across the board, if they don't want to give it to you, they won't, even if they have to. And they'll come up with some excuse so that you can never show that that's happening, but that's the reality.
Joanna, it takes a team to do a big series like this. Can you talk to us, can you explain to us, the process, the planning process and the reporting process and the putting the story together? What did that take?
Well, it started with Dave and me working together in the beginning, and then Dave quickly sucked up our photo intern. As Dave likes to tell the story, he knew our photo intern wanted to do good work and was an intern for a short time and was willing to work all hours or any hours of the day and night. So
Before long, the two of them were working closely together. And an interesting thing happened during the early stages of this reporting as it became clear that what Dave had was something great, but still a lot of work to be done. Our newspaper was purchased by a Denver businessman named Philip Anschutz. And so Dave and I are working down this path and Michael Ciaglo, the photographer who took these incredible images and many more that are on Gazette.com if you want to go find them. We're all working along together, and boom, we have new ownership and new bosses. And that was a delicate thing that I thought was my job.
They were freaked out.
To negotiate, to very carefully negotiate this, because we had new ownership and new bosses who were new to town. They were busy meeting the head of the chamber, the mayor, the head of the city council, the head of the commissioners, and all of the military installations. And as word got out about what Dave was working on, word got to our ownership that, what's this good-for-nothing Dave up to? New owners of the Gazette, you really should put a stop to that. And we also had a new editor, and again, I thought part of my job was to prepare him for what we were working on and get buy-in from him. So that was an early part of the team, trying to build a team around that. And then, of course, another crucial part was bringing in the copy editors, the page designer, the photo director, the online editor, our social media folks, all of whom we needed to get this done.
Yeah, because our paper is really easy to ignore. Like we had to like.
What is your circulation?
Daily, we're around 60, 70,000.
So we knew it was a bigger story, and like the cool thing, like despite all the like doom and gloom about journalism, is, 10 years ago the Gazette's reach was the daily circulation, and that's just not true anymore. Social media drove this story, and we knew that going in, and like how were we going to try and roll it out to this larger community that we knew would be receptive.
The thing that was a challenge is, of course, we're a daily newspaper and a daily website, and we do not have an investigative copy desk and an investigative photo department and an investigative page design department. These are all folks who work really hard all day long, and then we said, oh, and here's a really great project too, so can you join us on it and work really hard and stay really late and copy edit it after you've put out an entire paper every day. And we couldn't have done it without them, and that part about building the team was really crucial, and it was crucial to do it not too early but not too far down the road either, because we really needed buy-in from everybody, really everybody in the newsroom. We're not that big a newsroom, but everybody knew what we were working on just about toward the end, and were, I would say, really rooting for us.
The package you had lots of multimedia elements, and I'd like to play one because it's particularly interesting, and it's based on maybe while I try to get this going, can you give us can you explain what's in this?
Sure, this came fairly late in the reporting. Yeah. So while we were reporting, Paul Sassy, the guy you saw in handcuffs, was sitting in jail. And while we were there, he got assaulted pretty badly in the jail by the guards. And we were able to get the surveillance. Again, we use the open records request laws, and they said no. And so we got it slipped to us by a sympathetic defense attorney. And it was really, for me, it showed that like this discussion we're having is not academic. So this guy was sitting in jail because the Army didn't know what to do with him. And because he's sitting in jail and unstable, he resists the guards and they beat him up. And then they beat him up and they charge him with assaulting the guards. So he's now looking at an additional 20 years on a civilian charge. And so like we immediately got to see this societal consequence that I was talking about of like, if you don't deal with the problem early, you will deal with it in a larger point later. It's not just me like going blah, 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 you better be careful. You can see it happen.
This is the hospital surveillance
video. This is the jail.
The jail surveillance video.
Yeah, so what's going on is they put him in solitary, and they've been keeping him without charge in solitary confinement for months, which is crazy, but was going on. And they tell him, hey, you need to come out of your solitary cell. And he says, I'm not coming out. So then they essentially say, yes, you are, we're going to make you, and now you're going to see them make him.
He thought he was still, he didn't realize where he was, right, Dave?
Yeah, he
thought
he's
he was
delusional.
still, he thought he was still in combat.
Yeah.
So let's play the video.
Is it going to have audio? If not, I can
I-
commentate.
I hope it will have audio.
In July 2012, Sergeant Paul Sassy was an inmate at the El Paso County Jail. The Iraq War veteran had been diagnosed with TBI and PTSD and thought he was in an Iraqi prison. One day, when Sassy refused to leave his cell, sheriff's deputies decided they would remove him by force. They started by spraying pepper spray through a slot at the base of his door. After several sprays of pepper spray, a deputy kicks closed the slot to hold the spray in. A team of officers then comes to extract him from the room, bringing with them a chair to wheel him away on. The sting of the pepper spray is so strong that a medical technician has to turn away and cover her face. Sassy says officers punched and kicked him when they entered his cell. Officers say Sassy punched and kicked them, and he was charged with 3 counts of assault. If convicted, he faces 15 to 48 years in prison. A few minutes later, they drag him from the room in handcuffs. The deputies strap him in a chair, put a muzzle on him, and wheel him away to another cell. Paul Sassy spent the next several months in solitary confinement without charge, developing what one doctor called severe psychiatric disease. As the deputies haul him away, Sassy's blood is left on the jailroom floor.
Please tell us there's a happy ending to this story.
Actually, there's an amazingly happy ending to this story. So after we reported it, they dropped all civilian and military charges to him. He had to essentially plead guilty and get no punishment. It's a deferred sentence where he says, yes, I did this, but they won't punish him. He was let out of jail. He was put in a special medical unit at Fort Carson that gave him very good care. He was medically retired. He got out in fairly recently, late August. And he moved back to Maryland, which is where he's from. He's doing very well. He and I are we keep up on Facebook. So his thing is he just got one of those PTSD service dogs, which is really great. He also got together, I didn't see this coming, he got back together with his wife, who he had seriously assaulted during his PTSD and medicine-induced mania. And they patched things up, and they have 3 kids. So, I mean, it's worked out as well as it possibly could.
Joanna, what are your key takeaways here? I think there's a very good lesson here on how a small newspaper can win a Pulitzer. And what are the key lessons that you've gotten from this? Experience?
I would say first, we didn't do this because we thought we were going to win anything. We did it because we thought it was the right thing to do, especially in our community, which, as Dave pointed out, we have 5 military installations, including a very large Army installation that deploys, in fact, is about to deploy a unit to Africa in the Ebola effort, and is about to deploy to the Middle East regarding the ISIS work that has been talked about. So we thought it was a very, very, very important story to do, not because we thought we could have a run at a prize. And I would say, boy, one of the biggest takeaways is try not to lose your prize-winning journalist to the New York Times. I don't know quite how you do that, but
You offer more money.
I don't know.
Or BuzzFeed.
One of the takeaways has been that to build a team early enough that really believes you can do this. We have wonderful journalists in the newsroom, and the key was to elevate the expectations and all believe that we could all work together and do this. That there was no reason at all that a newspaper our size couldn't do this kind of work. And we never thought that we couldn't. We didn't think it was too big or it was too hard, or we just thought it would take some time, and it did. And I suppose another key takeaway is I wish I'd been a little more patient. Our timeline was not our ownership or our managerial timeline, and we had some frustrations around that. But never do I regret that we pushed as hard as we did. And I really do think it's about building the right team and believing in the work, and that any size newspaper can do this work.
Well, yeah, all the tools that we used are tools that you guys have. You know, we didn't travel particularly. We didn't use, I mean, we used YouTube and like, you know, a free video editing software. It wasn't
Open records
It wasn't
requests,
fancy. Open records
interviews.
requests. You know, the only expensive thing was the time, but like it's just reporting, and it's not even reporting really from like a sense of like really in-depth knowledge. The best thing we had going in is that we didn't know what was going on, you know, and we had this sense of like, are you kidding me? That just seems like so incorrect. How can that possibly be? And how do I learn why this is happening? Which obviously is all of you have, or you wouldn't be here. So these are tools that everybody can use.
Yeah?
I would just add that we really saw this as a story that was very important for our local community, but that we suspected had national implications. And so part of the work for us was developing the national reporting part too, but we thought it was a really important story in our community. I mean, these are veterans who are in our jail, they're in line at the grocery store, they're on the PTA. Our community is full of veterans who are a very important part of our community, and that's how I always looked at it. I always looked at it as our story for our newspaper to do.
Questions from our audience, students? Yes.
Hi. With a story like this, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on a reporter's impulse maybe to downplay the crimes that are committed in order to have your reader focus on your subject's humanity, and then realize that like the effect is much smaller and less sinister than the cause. Thanks.
Good question. You didn't want to become an apologist for guys who were doing bad things. The particular case of, can we go back to Paul Sassy's picture of him in handcuffs?
Yeah.
This guy beat his wife up, and then when the MPs showed up, he beat them up. So how do you balance showing his humanity without downplaying the crimes? One of the things that I knew I wanted to go in with is, we were writing this in 2013, and I think by that point, most of the media thought like PTSD, TBI, been there, done that, like done, you know, like people in the public as well, like they saw these acronyms, they're like, yeah, I know what that's about. Okay, so I knew that I had a challenge of like, how do I make you actually listen to this again? And it was to not get caught up in like rote ideas, but to just tell these stories as this is a guy and here is what happened to him. And then by the time I get to the point where he's at his house, you know, smashing his wife's head against their Jeep, you will know how he got there. And you will be able to decide, you know, what should be the correct response to this act.
And in fact, that's the language that we used in the story. We never at all wanted to back away from describing exactly what veterans and soldiers had done, because that's not really fair to the reader to back away from that at all. And I'll say too that Dave spent a lot of time making sure that we were zeroed in on what the story was. This wasn't about every veteran, or this wasn't about veterans who had other kinds of issues, or we were very careful about narrowing the focus on what exactly the story was that we wanted to tell. So there were other types of stories that Dave put aside and that we didn't report on that weren't in the band of what we were trying to do, which was veterans who had multiple tours, they weren't in other kinds of trouble, they committed crimes, They were facing other than honorable discharges, and they would lose their benefits for life. So, for example, this wasn't a soldier who served in kitchen duty and then came back and beat his wife up. These were combat veterans.
We'll take one more question. Yes.
Hi, first off, thanks for your intro comment about your time as a student here. My question was, I know you mentioned your circulation is much smaller than more national newspapers that have a couple more Pulitzers to their names. And I know some reporters at some of the bigger name papers can spend like a year on one story and don't have to worry about reporting on other stories because they're allocated those resources. And I was wondering how you were able to balance this in-depth piece with your regular duties, or how much, yeah.
You want to answer that, or should I?
You can talk about it from a reporter, and I'll talk
Okay.
about it as the editor.
So the short answer is that Joanna is a great person.
Thank you, Dave.
I didn't do a whole lot else, and I think that worked just because she knew that I was busting my ass and bringing in good stuff, and like she kind of wanted to see it all come together. You know, if I was sitting around, you know, like dragging my heels on a story that wasn't all that good and didn't deserve the resources I was giving it, I think that she'd be like, okay, I also need you to do this and this, and that happened later, but it didn't happen at that time.
I'll say for the rest of us, we had day jobs to do, and this was very much a labor of love that happened largely outside the office, because I had many other duties that were legitimate duties. So, you know, to have a reporter who can do this almost full time was a decision we made, and but I don't want to downplay the role that everybody else played, because they did it, you know, as a labor of love. Like I said, we had copy editors who got the paper out every day, and then they stayed till the middle of the night copy editing this.
Thank you.
Thank you. We can have more questions later after our last panel. So it's my pleasure to introduce the third and final story we are honoring tonight. It's a series of commentaries by Stephen Henderson from the Detroit Free Press, who won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary. On July 18, 2013, Detroit became the largest U.S. city to declare bankruptcy. In the period that followed, during that period, Stephen Henderson became the voice that was heard by all who had a stake in that historic process: state officials, city officials, judges, and most of all, the people of New York. As editorial page editor of the Detroit Free Press, Stephen has concentrated his firepower on the problems of bankrupt Detroit, a once great city neglected for decades. Not content to publish editorials on the editorial page, he often wrote hard-hitting page-one columns that stirred reaction. Stephen is Detroit-born and bred, although he's had stints as a journalist in D.C., Baltimore, and Chicago. In 2013, his mission was this: draw from his own experience growing up in Detroit, understand what it's like to live in neighborhoods that now have such high levels of crime and low levels of public services that they have become unlivable, and then help citizens figure out a path forward. His goal was simple: make lives better for Detroiters. Stephen's writing was passionate but also nuanced. In one column, he wrote, in the midst of the blame throwing about the state of the city, he said, "No one factor drove Detroit's decline. No one person cast the city's fortunes or doomed its future. It was the confluence of a great many things over a spectacular span of time." Stephen also went against the grain. While the Free Press editorial board takes a liberal stand, Stephen was not afraid to support an emergency financial manager who was opposed by most of the city's Democratic leaders. He also eloquently supported the decision to file for bankruptcy in the midst of protests. When the Free Press team dug into the city's financial records and published a definitive series entitled "How Detroit Went Broke," Stephen built on their research to confront the accusation that the city's African-American political leaders caused its decline. Simple taglines and slogans don't explain Detroit's financial difficulties, he said. For eschewing simplistic slogans and being a passionate but rational voice, Stephen was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for commentary. So Stephen, how did you end up playing this role as the interlocutor of Detroit politics?
That's actually a really long question, has a long answer. I mean, I came home to Detroit in 2007 after about 12 years away. I was born there and grew up there and went to the University of Michigan and was a young intern at the paper and then a young reporter at the paper. But then I left in 1995. There was a terrible newspaper strike in Detroit that sent a lot of people away, including me. But I always said I'd come home, that doing the kind of journalism I like to do would mean the most to me in the city where I was born. And I made good on that in 2007 when the paper called and said that they would like me to come and help lead the editorial page. I came home and the first column I wrote was, the first line I wrote in a column was about how I might be insane for having left Washington in a very cushy job covering the Supreme Court to come back to a city and a state that were in awful, awful condition. People in Washington looked at me like I was crazy when I said I was going home. And of course, I was rewarded for that statement by watching that city and that state really experience an incredible low over the last 7 years. The first thing that happened was that our mayor, who at the time was a man named Kwame Kilpatrick, somebody I had known almost since early childhood, and was a real beacon of hope for the city, sort of embroiled in a major sex scandal that blossomed into a federal RICO case and sent him off to federal prison. Then, of course, the auto companies that sustained Detroit financially for the last 50 or 60, 70 years had to file bankruptcy and reorganize. And then the city itself hit this tremendous low. And it really is, it's wonderful timing, I think, in some ways, that I got back when I did and was able to sort of adopt that voice. But it's also not coincidence. I mean, I always said that the most important work I would do would be in the city of Detroit.
How difficult it is to be writing about your own city, about people, as you said, you've known from childhood, about neighborhoods you've grown up in.
Yeah, I mean, that's very difficult. I mean, I say all the time, I'm not just a public observer of the things that I'm writing about. I'm a personal witness to them. I'm a personal witness to the city's decline and the number of people who've moved away, and then the people who have stayed and the suffering that they endure. I live in the city. I'm raising 2 children in the city, so all of the choices that we have to make about safety and education and just basic services, those get made around my kitchen table as much as they get made anywhere else. And so I think that drives a lot of the passion that I have in the work, and it means something to me that goes far beyond the newspaper or far beyond journalism. Obviously, you have to be careful not to over-personalize it, but I think one of the real strengths of being from Detroit is that I have the sort of credibility and authority to speak as a Detroiter, not to speak for Detroiters. I'm very careful not to arrogate quite that much, but to speak as a Detroiter, as somebody who's experiencing the same things that everybody else is and wants things to get better because I need them to be better. I need them to be better for me and my family as much as the other families who live there.
I mean, you live in a city with a long and troubled history of racial politics. Do people see you as representing a particular community or a particular point of view?
I think there's no question that I get, I get pigeonholed sometimes as an African American voice, in Detroit, and there are expectations that come with that, and sometimes I disappoint those expectations. There are also times when I am proud to sort of meet the expectations of being an African American voice in a city that's led and populated by an African American majority. That's sort of a tough thing to endure. I actually had a conversation with a friend over the weekend about this last 5 years in this job and how different it has been for me. I'm the first African American editorial page editor at the Free Press, and this person was telling me how difficult it looks from the outside to do the job in the city and have to bear that burden in addition to the other leadership roles. It's not something that I try to wear on my sleeve, but it's something that I'm always aware of.
What were, the best and worst responses you've gotten from readers? I mean, you wrote a column, like you wrote a column mocking protesters for blocking a highway, saying, they should have better things to do, like picking up trash or volunteering in recreation centers. I mean, what kind of response did you get to that?
Yeah, I got a lot of blowback from that. I mean, there were people who pointed out that they were activists and that they do pick up trash, or that they have spent a lot of time working in neighborhoods trying to build community. And of course, I wasn't talking about them. I was talking about the people who are, I mean, one of the great sort of mysteries, I think, of Detroit is how we as Detroiters have come to accept less in terms of services, less in terms of competence, less in terms of just about everything. I have always sort of prided myself on trying to identify the voice of reason as the most underrepresented voice in Detroit. It's not the voice of African Americans or the poor. It's the voice of logic and of sort of considered thought. And I try to stick to that, and I try to stay out of a lot of the more pugnacious arguments and discussions that go on, because I think they help reinforce that idea that we don't have solutions or that we can't get past where we are, and sort of removing ourselves from that is the path forward. So
does the voice of reason sell?
I think it does. I get a lot of positive feedback from people who believe that that's what's missing. That's what's often missing in the dialogue, and that's what's missing in the discussion about leadership. And among leaders in the city, that so often we have made the irrational decision or the emotional decision, and that's what led us to this incredible low. And it's a low of finance. The dictionary definition of the low of finance is bankruptcy, but it's also a cultural and social low in the city. I mean, the very first column I wrote about the prospect of bankruptcy talked about fire trucks getting to houses too late before they could burn to the ground, ambulances showing up long after people can be helped. These are the lows that we live with every day, and that I try to sort of get us to think we deserve better. We deserve better, and we can get better.
Great. So I think we have someone who's eager to ask a question here. Yes.
Mr. Henderson, how do you muster the courage to take these controversial stands and take on the fierce criticism that you may occasionally face for that? How do you muster that courage? That's my question.
I always think when I'm writing about, I think about the city and growing up in the city and the incredible attachment that I have to the city. I come from a family that was deeply involved in union politics in the city. First, the expansion of African American leadership in the unions in the late 50s, early 60s is what brought my family to Detroit. I grew up with political leaders in my family who helped build it into the place that I remember, that I can picture very easily from the 1970s. That gives me an incredible amount of courage. I mean, it gives me an incredible amount of authority, I feel like, that I am a son of the city in a way that not many other people can claim to be. In addition, I mean, I would be remiss if I didn't say that all the other experiences I had also give me that incredible courage. I mean, if I had stayed in Detroit after the strike in 1995 and been there for the last 20 years, I think I would have a very different point of view about those things, and I would have less to sort of build on. The time I spent some time in Kentucky writing about coal mines and going into coal mines. I've seen that story up close. You know, I spent time in Chicago looking at schools there and learning about helped the Chicago Tribune build its first website back in the late 1990s, and I spent 5 terms covering the U.S. Supreme Court and learning about the law, learning about judging and argument and things like that. All of those things feed into the work that I do every day, and they give me courage. I mean, I think the things I've learned from those experiences make me feel more like I do have a strong and authoritative voice, and less likely to back down when people push back against it.
So another question for Stephen. Yes.
Good evening. I was interested in this question anyway, but it seems especially relevant given what you said about being the first African-American editorial page editor at the Free Press, and also the pigeonholing you felt because of that sometimes. What do you think is added by using your byline and photograph with these pieces as opposed to just having unsigned editorials like most papers might?
That's a wonderful question. I think that's a question that every editorial page editor is facing around the country right now. The decline in credibility that's associated with institutions that I think we see play out all the time in social media, I think is really driving us to think really hard about when that institutional voice has weight and when it needs to be what we put out front, and when somebody's personal voice is what can carry us. I think in this specific case, there was no question that that because I am a Detroiter, and because I care so deeply about the city, and our readers know that, they knew that before the bankruptcy, that putting my face and my name out front made the most sense. But in other contexts, we struggle with that all the time. I mean, I don't know what the future of the institutional voice looks like or how often it needs to be used. I know, for instance, it'll always have to be used with endorsements, political endorsements. That shouldn't come from a person. That should come from the institution. There are lots of other cases where in 10, 15 years ago, we absolutely would have used that institutional voice, where now we use a person, a column. People, you think about the way we interact on social media, it's always person to person. There's always somebody associated with the thought or the feeling that's being expressed, and so people come to expect that, and I think they're coming to expect that from media organizations as well. We've started taking to joking on my staff that the institutional voice is like the daddy voice, right? The thing you bring out when you're really mad and you're scolding somebody, which tells you something about its anachronistic nature as well. I don't know that it has as much of a future as I think other people would argue it does. I think we get more done as individuals representing the institution than we do speaking in that sort of anonymous institutional voice.
Thank you.
Is someone else going to ask a question? Was there someone? Okay, yes, very quickly, please, yeah.
You compare your time as a Detroiters, and you say that they come to expect first. Do you share the same as member of the Afro-American community, knowing the whole bonanza of the past Detroit automobile industry and the Motown and so forth? Do you think that the situation of the present Afro-American community in Detroit have improved or have any future in Detroit as it is now?
I was born in 1970, and Coleman Young, who was the first African-American mayor of Detroit, was elected in 1973. So my life really is the story of the development of the sort of playing out of the maturity of black leadership in Detroit. I am always very careful to sort of affix a sort of nuanced filter to what that has meant for black people in Detroit and the African American community. I mean, things are not better now than they were in 1973 for black people in Detroit. You couldn't argue that in a million years. But there are a lot of reasons that's true, and most of them have nothing to do with the African American leadership that's been in place. I mean, I think the bankruptcy is an opportunity. It gets a lot of debt off our back. It makes government more nimble and able to address some of the problems that we see, particularly in our neighborhoods. I mean, I don't know how many of you have ever been to Detroit, but it's absolutely worth a visit. There is no American city quite like it right now. I mean, you would never see the scale of devastation and abandonment like we have experienced over the last 40 years. I'm somewhat hopeful that things will get better. I think we have the opportunity to make them better. But the poverty, the economic isolation, the lack of good schools, those are the things that are driving the African American experience in neighborhoods right now. And if we can't address those things, and think about how many other cities struggle with those, we can't get things to be better. I'm an African American. I live in the city. I'm raising 2 kids who are African American living in the city. I think that is part of the solution. We have got to get more African Americans who are educated and middle class to live in the city and invest in it, and raise the level of services and economic opportunity available to the people who have been left behind. Detroit story, a lot of people, I think, confuse Detroit story with the story of white flight, that all the white people left for the suburbs and took money with them, which did happen. But the story of Detroit over the last 10 to 15 years has been economic flight. African Americans with means leaving the city, and leaving poor people behind. We've got to reverse that trend, I think, if you're going to improve life for the people who are still there.
Thank you, Stephen. I now would like to open the floor out to any questions from any member of our panel. There's a microphone in the center of the room. Yes, please. Please just go ahead and...
I have a question for David. How's it like to talk to, interview people with severe psychological problems?
I would say that you just take your time and be patient. People's memories are pretty bad. They're often reluctant to talk about their combat experiences, and I think if you ask them specifically about them, you'd never get an answer. But I found just to have a conversation with them, maybe starting with how they joined the Army and having them take you through step by step their experiences works pretty well. At the same time, because some of these guys' memory was so unreliable, I had to try and follow up on every detail by confirming it with other people who were there or through records or something like that.
Yes, please. Please approach the microphone.
Long way. So, since David was talking, I just have a question for him and then a general question. I just want to know if you have any idea what the government is doing with these soldiers, because when they send away, I think that they know how they will come back. There have been a lot of researchers by psychiatrists, psychologists about how violent situation can affect people behaviors. So my question is, in your article, did you address how the why or why not the government is treating these people when they come back? Because the American government, since Vietnam War, has researched the behavior of people, and Freud, Eric Dichter have written a lot of books and articles about behavior.
So your question is, how does this compare to previous wars?
No.
Is that your question? No.
My question is if David knows why the government is not addressing returning soldiers.
Okay.
And then I have a general question. I mean, if I can have two.
Yes.
So, now, it's nice to hear about all these investigative works, but my concern is about another profession that is taking over journalism, which is public relations. I just want to know, how does public relations affect the work of an investigative journalist? Okay.
All right, so that's a tough one. We can
Let's
organize
just answer-
a
let's
whole
just answer
panel
the
about
second,
that.
because they're both huge questions. Let's answer the second.
Right.
That's
The first
really-
question, David, you take it, and then we'll have the others address the second question. So what is the government doing about returning soldiers?
You know, actually, there's a ton of people within the military doing good things to actually try to help people who have been, wounded in war, including psychologically. But there's also people who are sending those people off to get hurt, whether through gunshots or otherwise. Why does it happen? It's a huge policy question that I can't get to. It's human nature that's been going on forever. But it has been interesting to see so much of the response to Iraq and Afghanistan was shaped by Vietnam. And our perceived response or lack of response to Vietnam. And I think that's still going on today. And to see how we really do treat people, how we respond to veterans is a lot how we thought we did wrong to people in Vietnam. And so the idea of saying thank you for your service to everyone. I just got off the phone today with a guy who runs a nonprofit who's a veteran, and he said, here's the thing that the society doesn't get. They think that we are all broken heroes that, did something totally heroic, but now we come back forever scarred and we'll never be the same, and now we need the pity and the help of society. And 99% of us are neither broken nor heroes. We're people that are coming back and need to get back to work. So that's sort of what I'm thinking about now, is how do you tell that story of all these people who've come back and can't find their place, but there's nothing necessarily wrong with them, except that they don't know where they fit anymore.
So the big PR question.
By PR, are you talking about native advertising and native content and content marketing and all of these things we are talking about now in journalism? I don't know that I have all the answers. I'm curious what Chris will say working for BuzzFeed. I will say that, I will tell you that we did not have a single advertiser that I'm aware of come forward after the work that we published and say, that was tremendous work. I would like to buy, and I own a sofa company, and I would like to buy an ad in your newspaper. That did not happen. We had a tremendous outpouring from readers who appreciated the work we were doing, but I struggle now, mid-career, with this disconnect between what I believe readers want out of newspapers and journalism and what advertisers are willing to support and what circulation is willing to support. And I don't quite understand or know the bridge yet that's going to be built, because we still believe the work we're doing is really important, and we watch the advertising continue to decline. So I don't know that I have a great answer for that, other than if we can all figure out a way to support journalism, then I'm open to hearing about it. I don't know that I would have said that 15 years ago, but I still want to do the work that we're doing. And if we can figure out a way, for example, to label and be transparent about what is the types of content that journalism is producing or that journalism is somehow attached to, then I'm willing to talk about that, because the road that we're on now doesn't look great. Like I said, it's not, we didn't have a lot of advertisers come out of the woodwork after we won a Pulitzer saying, I would love to advertise in your newspaper today.
Chris, balls in your court.
So, first of all, I mean, look, I probably would have been more apprehensive about, I probably would have had a different answer to that sort of question 10 years ago as well. The truth is, we have to get money from somewhere. And I mean, unless you know a lot of billionaires who are just going to donate money to us to produce investigative journalism that might make them look bad, I'm not really sure. I don't have all the answers. But, you know, I will say that I don't, there's some criticism of advertorials or native advertising. I have come sort of to the view that I don't really view that much differently than other advertising, and in fact, you'll sometimes see advertorials in newspapers as well. I think, like Joanna said, the key is just to be transparent and label everything. And I think that at BuzzFeed, we do that. I mean, it's very, very clear what is a sponsored post. And I mean, you know, I don't think anyone looking at it would mistake a list compiled by Hershey's of chocolate chip stuff with some BuzzFeed. I could be wrong about that. But I mean, I would just say we have to pay for it somewhere. Stuff may look different now. We're sort of in a new format here. So BuzzFeed doesn't look like a daily newspaper. It's not supposed to. But I would say the principles underlying it are the same. The firewall between the advertising and the editorial, the principles of labeling everything and being transparent with your readers. So I think it's how do we apply the same journalistic principles and ethics to an ever-changing sort of media environment.
Stephen, I presume that the fortunes of the news industry in Detroit sort of mirror the cities.
They're pretty bad. You know, I mean, I think everyone understands the business model that, you know, has served this industry since Ben Franklin was publishing newspapers is broken. It does not work. We've got to find something else. I think there are a lot of interesting experiments going on. Some places we are going back to the future. You know, Jeff Bezos buying the Post is a good example of the sort of, you know, maybe I shouldn't use this word, but you know, the rich oligarch who owns a newspaper and doesn't really worry about how much newspaper or how much money it makes. Is that the future? I don't know. I mean, he's certainly trying to find a way to make more money off of this. I am really intrigued right now by the expansion of journalism in the nonprofit space. Public media, we're seeing these sort of new, very creative nonprofit journalism outfits crop up in Michigan who are doing really, really serious, in-depth work on a model that doesn't care whether their return is, you know, 15% next year as opposed to 12. Is that the future? I'm not sure. I think the one thing that gives me real hope is that, you know, you have people sitting up here who did incredible work that made an incredible difference, and there is an incredible thirst for that. Our work, I think, has never been more important or in demand than it is now. The question is, how do we pay for it? I always figured that question will get answered because the work is so vital, but we'll probably struggle for a while we figure it out.
Yes, please.
A question for Chris and a question for David. Chris, you said that there was some apprehension by your editors. You feared that there would be some apprehension by your editors when discussing the law firms that were, you know, supporting the coal companies. How come you were fearful about that? Like, I know the obvious libel issues. How come you were so fearful about revealing that information? And for David, Do veterans now, because of your reporting on that issue, do they view you as a friend, in a way, as someone who's fighting for their cause?
Well, I'm not sure that I said that I was fearful of publishing it. It's just something that's always in the back of your mind, that we have to be very careful and document our facts extensively. And so, no, I mean, this is exactly the kind of story that I want to find, and I want to, expose what's going on in these sorts of situations. I think it's just sort of a part of the profession that you have to think about risks as well. And I think that's all I was really trying to convey, is that, there is a serious risk when you're taking on a litigious organization. And you have to think about that throughout the process.
David,
So the military is so vast that there are people that hate me, and there's people that really appreciate what I do. And it's hard to figure out which is what you're going to encounter.
yes.
Hey, so congratulations and thanks for coming. Really good talk. So you guys are sitting basically at the pinnacle of journalism right now, where we all hope to be. And I'd really be curious to hear if you just have like a little brief piece of advice for us who are just embarking on the beginning of our careers. Thank you.
Words of wisdom for aspiring journalists, aspiring Pulitzer Prize winners. Yeah.
Don't aspire to be a Pulitzer Prize winner.
I was going to say something really profound, like work hard, write a lot. Dave's heard me say this before. I equate journalism a lot to baseball, and you need a lot of at-bats, singles, doubles, and triples, and just write, cover night cops and City Hall and the Supreme Court, and there are great stories to be written everywhere, on every beat, all the time, every day, in every community, everywhere. And it sounds very simple, but I would venture to guess all of us have worked very, very hard, and hard work goes a long way, I would say.
As long as we have liberty and freedom.
You want to add to that?
I would say, I mean, I count myself among the most fortunate journalists in the country, because I live in the city where I was born. I get to write about the city I care about more than any other place, and I don't think it's an accident that I feel like the work has reached a new level of performance because of that. I think identifying what that is for you, whether that's a place or a thing or a topic, I think is a real key, and not everybody gets to do it, obviously. So I'm always really thankful that I do.
And I would add to all that, you don't have to be the most well-credentialed, brilliant, you don't have to be the most anything. A lot of it is sort of, there's some being in the right place at the right time involved, and a lot of it is working hard and trying to just make the most of whatever situation you're in. I have got a big stack of rejection letters on all kinds of things. I mean, and it's a motivator. 4 years ago, I was applying for jobs and people wouldn't even respond to me. And I was fortunate to land at the Center for Public Integrity, which is a great place, which is one of the few places in the country who would let some 28-year-old kid spend a year on a project like this. And I couldn't have done that anywhere else. Now, if you have in your mind, I have to be at, I don't know, the New York Times, which is a great, everyone would love to work there, and that's a great thing. But I mean, make the most of whatever situation you're in, and just because you think you're at the alt weekly in some small town doesn't mean you can't do great work. And I think that's especially magnified these days with, like Dave was saying, I mean, the social media really can magnify something that probably, previously would have been a big story in Colorado, and now it's a big national story. So you can do a story for a small outlet, and it can blow up.
Yeah, I would say that the cool thing that you guys have going on, like the bad thing is you're going to have trouble getting dental, but national healthcare policy is changing, so that's good. But the good thing is in 2002, when I got out of school, the gatekeepers of the industry were still very much in place. You had big corporate-owned newspapers or TV that were running the show, and if you wanted to get any story out, you had to do that. Otherwise, you're going to be writing for some zine that was published on a photo Xerox machine. Seriously, there was no way to reach audience. That's over. That's been destroyed, right? You now using this is crazy. You now using this can write your story and publish it to the whole world. Okay, right? So that's really cool because it's upended this hierarchy, and I don't know, you guys are going to find your way, and it's probably going to really suck, but it's going to be an unpleasant and difficult journey, but you're going to find your way through this landscape, and you'll just go to the places that call you and find the ways to reach the audience that you want to. But you now have a million different ways, whereas before there was very few ways.
Thank you so much to our panel. We will remember that, their words of wisdom. Most of all, work hard. Journalism is a labor of love. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. And I just want to take one crack at this question myself based on what we heard tonight, and that is that if you listen carefully, every one of these stories began with people. And if they wound up being people that were terribly affected by failed institutions and venal institutions. And those are the kinds of stories I think that you will want to pursue wherever you wind up working. And I also want to thank the panelists for just a wonderful night. Thank you so much.